Picture this. You're standing in your bedroom, perhaps scrolling through your phone before sleep, when suddenly you stumble upon a historical fact so bizarre that it makes modern celebrity scandals look like Sunday school lessons. You pause, reread the sentence, and think to yourself, there's no way this actually happened. But it did. Throughout history, absolute power hasn't just corrupted absolutely, it's created some of the most jaw-dropping, mind-bending habits that would make reality TV producers weep with envy. What I'm about to share with you are 10 stories of kings and emperors whose personal quirks were so outrageous, so completely unhinged, that they've become legendary for all the wrong reasons. These aren't your typical tales of royal excess or political intrigue. These are stories about rulers who took their power and twisted it into something so strange, so deeply disturbing, that their own subjects questioned whether they were ruled by humans or monsters. Before we dive into these forgotten chapters of royal madness, if you're fascinated by the darker corners of history, like I am, smash that like button and subscribe for more content that explores the stories they don't teach in school. And please, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I find it incredible that we can explore these ancient tales together from different corners of the world, connected by our shared curiosity about the strangest moments in human history. Now, the first king on our list didn't just abuse his power. He used it to reshape reality itself, turning his personal tragedies into public spectacles that would haunt the Roman Empire for generations. This is the story of a man who believed the entire world was his stage, and every person in it was merely a player in his twisted performance. Our journey begins in the marble corridors of imperial Rome, where Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus ruled from 54 to 68 AD. But this isn't the story you might expect about the emperor who allegedly fiddled while Rome burned. This is about something far more disturbing, far more personal, and far more revealing about what absolute power can do to the human psyche. Nero's descent into madness began not with political pressure or military defeat, but with love, or what he believed was love. In 62 AD, he married Poppaea Sabina, a woman whose beauty was legendary throughout the empire. She was intelligent, ambitious, and had somehow captured the heart of the most powerful man in the world. For Nero, she represented everything he desired, not just physically, but emotionally. She was his anchor to humanity in a world where everyone else either feared him or wanted something from him. But Poppaea's story would end in tragedy that would push Nero beyond the boundaries of sanity. In 65 AD, during a fit of rage, Nero kicked his pregnant wife so violently that she died from her injuries. The details of that moment are lost to history, but what followed next reveals a mind that had completely severed its connection to reality. Nero's grief was unlike anything recorded in the annals of Roman history. He didn't just mourn his wife's death, he refused to accept it. He had her body embalmed and treated with the most expensive spices and perfumes money could buy. He spoke to her corpse as if she were still alive, holding conversations with her lifeless form and becoming enraged when she didn't respond. Palace servants reported hearing him weeping and pleading with her to come back to him, promising to be a better husband if she would just open her eyes. But here's where the story takes a turn that even the most imaginative horror writer couldn't conceive. Nero's obsession with replacing his dead wife led him to perhaps the most bizarre solution in recorded history. He began searching throughout the empire for someone who could, in his twisted mind, become Papates reborn. His search ended when he encountered a young man named Sporus, a freeman who bore a striking resemblance to his deceased wife. But Nero's plan wasn't simply to keep Sporus as a companion or lover. What he did next was so shocking that it scandalized even the notoriously decadent Roman elite. Nero ordered that Sporus be castrated, not as punishment, but as transformation. He wanted to physically alter this young man to make him as close to a woman as possible, specifically to make him resemble Poppaea. The procedure was performed by the imperial physicians, who had no choice but to comply with their emperor's demands. Sporus survived the operation, but his ordeal was far from over. Once Sporus had recovered, Nero began the process of what he called restoration. He dressed the young man in women's clothing, specifically in gowns that had belonged to Poppaea. He had cosmetics applied to Sporus's face to enhance his feminine features and insisted that he wear jewelry and perfumes that his dead wife had favored. Palace servants were instructed to address Sporus with feminine names and titles, and anyone who referred to him as a man was severely punished. The transformation didn't stop with appearance. Nero forced Sporus to adopt feminine mannerisms, teaching him to walk, speak, and gesture like a woman. He hired tutors to train Sporus in the arts that Roman women of high status were expected to master, including music, poetry, and dance. The young man was essentially forced to become a living impersonation of the emperor's dead wife. But Nero's delusion reached its ultimate expression when he decided to marry Sporus in a formal ceremony. This wasn't a private affair or a symbolic gesture. This was a full imperial wedding, complete with all the traditional Roman rituals and ceremonies. Sporus was dressed in a bridal gown and veil, and the ceremony was conducted by priests who had no choice but to participate in this grotesque charade. The wedding was attended by senators, generals, and other high-ranking officials who sat in stunned silence as their emperor married a castrated man dressed as his dead wife. Contemporary historians describe the atmosphere as surreal, with guests unsure whether they were witnessing a religious ceremony, a theatrical performance, or the complete mental breakdown of their ruler. After the ceremony, Nero treated Sporus as his empress, giving him the title Augusta and requiring the entire court to show him the respect traditionally accorded to the emperor's wife. Sporus was forced to participate in state functions, religious ceremonies, and public appearances, always dressed as a woman and always playing the role of Poppaea's replacement. The psychological impact on Sporus himself can only be imagined. Historical accounts suggest that he initially resisted this transformation, but gradually, perhaps as a survival mechanism, he began to embrace the role. Some sources indicate that he developed a form of Stockholm syndrome, becoming emotionally dependent on Nero and even protective of him during the political turmoil that would eventually end the emperor's reign. The Roman people's reaction to this bizarre marriage was a mixture of horror, disgust, and dark fascination. While none dared to openly criticize the emperor, private conversations and written accounts from the period reveal a population that was deeply disturbed by their ruler's behavior. Many saw it as a sign that the gods had abandoned Rome, while others viewed it as proof that absolute power inevitably led to madness. The story of Nero and Sporus didn't end with their wedding. The emperor's delusion deepened as he began to believe that he had successfully brought his wife back to life. He would spend hours talking to Sporus about memories that only he and Poppaea had shared, becoming angry when Sporus couldn't remember events he had never experienced. He commissioned artists to create portraits of Sporus that made him look even more like Poppaea, and he had sculptures created that depicted them together as if they were the original couple. The most disturbing aspect of this relationship was how it revealed the complete absence of consent in Imperial Rome. Sporus had no choice in his transformation, no voice in his fate, and no escape from his role as a living memorial to a dead woman. He was, in every sense, a prisoner in his own body, forced to live as someone else for the amusement and psychological comfort of the most powerful man in the world. This wasn't just about sexual desire or even grief. This was about a man who had so much power that he believed he could reshape reality itself to suit his emotional needs. Nero's treatment of Sporus represents one of the most extreme examples of how absolute authority can corrupt not just politically, but psychologically, turning rulers into creators of their own twisted versions of reality. The implications of this story extend far beyond ancient Rome. It reveals something fundamental about human nature when it's given unlimited power over others. Nero's ability to transform another human being into his idolized replacement for his dead wife shows how power can make someone believe that other people exist solely for their benefit, to be molded and shaped according to their desires without any consideration for the humanity of those they're controlling. But this is just the beginning of our journey through the strange habits of history's most powerful rulers. The story of Nero and Sporus is shocking, but it's merely the first chapter in a collection of tales that will challenge everything you think you know about power, madness, and the human condition. What we've seen here is how grief and guilt can manifest in the most bizarre ways when combined with absolute authority. But as we'll discover, not all royal strangeness comes from tragedy. Sometimes it comes from something far more disturbing, something that suggests these rulers weren't just mad, but were operating according to a completely different understanding of what it means to be human. Our next ruler takes us from the twisted grief of imperial Rome to the sun-baked palaces of ancient Egypt, where power didn't just corrupt, it created a god complex so extreme that it redefined the very concept of divine madness. This is the story of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who ruled Egypt from 1353 to 1336 BC, and whose obsession with religious revolution led to habits so bizarre that they nearly destroyed one of history's greatest civilizations. But before we dive into Akhenaten's world, let me paint you a picture of what Egypt looked like before his reign. For over 1,000 years, Egypt had been the jewel of the ancient world, a civilization so advanced and stable that it seemed eternal. The pharaohs ruled as living gods, but they were gods who respected tradition, who honored the pantheon of deities that had guided Egypt since the dawn of time. They built temples to Amun-Ra, they consulted priests, they followed the ancient ways that had made Egypt prosperous and powerful. Then came Akhenaten, originally named Amenhotep IV, and everything changed. This wasn't gradual reform or political evolution. This was a complete upending of reality, orchestrated by a man who believed he had received divine revelation that superseded thousands of years of Egyptian wisdom. Akhenaten's transformation began with what he claimed was a vision from Aten, the sun disk, who allegedly spoke to him directly and told him that all other gods were false. This wasn't just a theological disagreement. This was a complete rejection of everything that made Egypt, Egypt. Imagine if the President of the United States suddenly declared that the Constitution was void and that he was implementing a completely new system of government based on messages he received from aliens. That's essentially what Akhenaten did to Egypt. His first act of religious revolution was to change his own name from Amenhotep, which honored the god Amun, to Akhenaten, meaning effective for Aten. But this was just the beginning. He declared that Aten was the only true god and that he, Akhenaten, was Aten's sole representative on earth. Not just a pharaoh, not just a living god in the traditional sense, but the exclusive intermediary between the divine and mortal realms. The physical transformation that accompanied this spiritual awakening was equally dramatic. Akhenaten began depicting himself in art with elongated features, an extended skull, feminine hips, and a protruding belly. These weren't artistic choices or stylistic preferences. Historical evidence suggests that Akhenaten actually altered his physical appearance to match these depictions, possibly through binding, cosmetics, or even surgical procedures that are lost to history. He required his artists to portray him with these exaggerated features, and more disturbing still, he insisted that his family members be depicted in the same way. His wife, Nefertiti, and his daughters were all shown with the same elongated skulls and unusual body proportions. This wasn't just artistic license. This was a family that had physically transformed themselves to match their ruler's vision of what divine beings should look like. But Akhenaten's obsession with religious purity extended far beyond personal appearance. He ordered the systematic destruction of temples throughout Egypt, not just closing them, but having them torn down stone by stone. He sent workers to chisel the names of traditional gods off monuments, effectively attempting to erase Egypt's religious heritage from existence. The name of Amun-Ra, the most important deity in Egyptian religion, was removed from inscriptions throughout the kingdom. The psychological impact on the Egyptian people was devastating. Imagine waking up one morning to discover that everything you believed about the divine, everything your ancestors had believed for generations, was suddenly declared false by royal decree. Priests who had devoted their lives to serving the traditional gods were thrown out of their temples. Religious festivals that had marked the rhythm of Egyptian life for centuries were banned. The very foundation of Egyptian identity was being systematically demolished. Akhenaten's daily routine reflected his complete immersion in this new religious system. He would rise before dawn to greet Aten as the sun appeared on the horizon, conducting elaborate ceremonies that he had designed himself. These rituals bore no resemblance to traditional Egyptian religious practices. Instead, they were spontaneous expressions of what Akhenaten claimed was divine inspiration received directly from the sun disk. He composed hymns to Aten, writing poetry that praised the sun god while explicitly rejecting all other deities. These weren't just religious songs. They were manifestos of his new world order, declarations that the old ways were not just wrong, but evil. He required his court to memorize these hymns and recite them daily, creating an atmosphere of constant religious indoctrination. The capital city of Thebes, with its magnificent temples and deep religious significance, was abandoned in favor of a completely new city that Akhenaten built from scratch. This new capital, called Akhetaten, meaning Horizon of Aten, was designed according to his religious visions. The city's layout, architecture, and decorations all reflected his monotheistic beliefs, with no reference to traditional Egyptian gods or symbols. The construction of Akhetaten revealed the extent of Akhenaten's megalomania. He didn't just want to build a city, he wanted to create a physical manifestation of his religious revolution, a place where his new order could flourish without contamination from the old ways. Workers labored around the clock to complete this project, not because of practical necessity, but because their pharaoh believed that Aten had commanded its construction. Living in Akhetaten was like living in a religious compound. The city's residents were required to participate in daily worship of Aten, following rituals that Akhenaten had invented. Traditional Egyptian customs were forbidden, replaced by new practices that often seemed arbitrary and nonsensical to people who had grown up with the old ways. The psychological pressure of living under such intense religious scrutiny drove many residents to despair. Akhenaten's treatment of his own family reveals the depth of his religious obsession. He had 6 daughters with Nefertiti, and he raised them according to his new religious principles, isolating them from traditional Egyptian culture. These children grew up knowing only their father's version of reality, never experiencing the rich religious and cultural heritage that had defined Egypt for millennia. The economic consequences of Akhenaten's religious revolution were catastrophic. The resources that had previously been used to maintain Egypt's military and infrastructure were diverted to building temples to Aten and supporting the new priesthood. Egypt's enemies began to sense weakness, and the empire that had once dominated the ancient world started to crumble at its borders. Perhaps most disturbing was Akhenaten's claim that he could communicate directly with Aten throughout the day, not just during sunrise ceremonies. Court officials reported seeing him standing alone in courtyards, apparently having conversations with the sun, gesturing and speaking as if receiving responses from the solar disk. These weren't brief moments of prayer or meditation. These were extended dialogues that could last for hours, during which the pharaoh would ignore pressing matters of state. The isolation that resulted from these habits was profound. Akhenaten became increasingly disconnected from his advisors, his military commanders, and even his own family. He lived in a world where his conversations with Aten were more real and more important than his interactions with human beings. The empire suffered as its ruler retreated deeper into his religious delusions. Historical records suggest that Akhenaten's behavior became increasingly erratic as his reign progressed. He would issue contradictory orders, claiming that Aten had given him new instructions that superseded previous commands. He developed elaborate conspiracy theories about priests of the old religion working to undermine his divine mission, leading to purges and executions based on paranoid suspicions rather than evidence. The pharaoh's death around 1336 BC remains mysterious, but what happened immediately afterward reveals how completely his religious revolution had failed. His successor, originally named Tutankhaten, changed his name to Tutankhamun, explicitly rejecting Akhenaten's monotheism and returning to traditional Egyptian religion. The new capital of Akhetaten was abandoned, and within a few years, it was reclaimed by the desert. More tellingly, Akhenaten's name was systematically removed from official records, and his religious innovations were treated as a dark period in Egyptian history that was best forgotten. The priests and officials who had survived his reign worked to restore the old ways, rebuilding temples and reinstituting traditional religious practices. It was as if Egypt was trying to wake up from a nightmare. The story of Akhenaten reveals how religious fanaticism, when combined with absolute power, can become a force of destruction rather than enlightenment. His genuine belief that he was receiving divine revelation made him impervious to criticism or doubt, creating a feedback loop of delusion that ultimately consumed both him and his kingdom. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Akhenaten's story is how it demonstrates the fragility of civilization itself. Egypt had seemed eternal, unshakable, a monument to human achievement that would last forever. Yet one man's religious obsession nearly brought it all crashing down, proving that even the mightiest empires are only as stable as the sanity of those who rule them. This pattern of religious delusion, combined with absolute authority, would repeat throughout history, but rarely with such devastating consequences for such a powerful civilization. Akhenaten's legacy serves as a warning about what happens when faith becomes fanaticism and when divine inspiration becomes indistinguishable from madness. Our next ruler will take us from the sun-worshipping pharaohs of Egypt to the blood-soaked battlefields of medieval Europe, where power manifested not through religious revolution, but through an appetite for violence so extreme that it redefined the very concept of cruelty. But our journey through the annals of royal madness doesn't end with the sun-worshipping pharaohs of ancient Egypt. From the religious delusions of Akhenaten, we travel across centuries and continents to encounter a ruler whose habits were so grotesque, so fundamentally disturbing, that they make even the most bizarre modern scandals seem tame by comparison. This brings us to our third king, a man whose name has become synonymous with cruelty so extreme that it inspired one of literature's most famous monsters. This is the story of Vlad III, known to history as Vlad the Impaler, who ruled Wallachia from 408 to 476 AD. But this isn't just about his legendary brutality in battle. This is about a daily routine so macabre, so psychologically twisted, that it reveals a mind that had completely redefined the relationship between power and human suffering. Vlad's story begins not with inherent evil, but with trauma that would shape his entire worldview. As a child, he and his brother were sent as hostages to the Ottoman court, where they witnessed methods of torture and execution that were considered normal parts of statecraft. But where others might have been horrified, young Vlad was fascinated. He studied these techniques with the dedication of a scholar, learning not just how to inflict pain, but how to maximize psychological impact through carefully orchestrated suffering. When Vlad finally claimed his throne, he brought with him an innovation that would make his name infamous throughout Europe. Impalement wasn't new, but Vlad refined it into an art form. He didn't just execute his enemies. He created elaborate displays of suffering that served as both entertainment and political messaging. His castle grounds became a gallery of human agony, with thousands of stakes bearing the slowly dying bodies of those who had displeased him. But here's where Vlad's habits become truly disturbing. He didn't just order these executions and walk away. He made them the centerpiece of his daily routine. Every morning, he would tour his forest of stakes, examining each victim like a gardener inspecting his plants. He would note which ones were still alive, which ones had died during the night, and which ones were suffering in particularly interesting ways. This wasn't casual cruelty. This was systematic study of human pain. Vlad's breakfast routine has been preserved in historical accounts that read like something from a horror novel. He would have his morning meal served at a table positioned directly among the impaled victims so that he could dine while surrounded by their screams and moans. Palace servants reported that he seemed to derive genuine pleasure from this arrangement, that the sounds of suffering actually improved his appetite. He would eat slowly, savoring both his food and the agony of those dying around him. The psychological impact of this routine on his court was devastating. Nobles and servants lived in constant terror, knowing that a single misstep could result in joining the morning's breakfast entertainment. But Vlad's genius lay in making this fear productive. His courtiers became so desperate to avoid his displeasure that they would compete to demonstrate their loyalty, creating an atmosphere of paranoid devotion that actually strengthened his rule. What made Vlad's impalement displays particularly disturbing was their artistic arrangement. He didn't just randomly place stakes around his castle. He organized them according to aesthetic principles, creating patterns and groupings that pleased his eye. Victims were arranged by height, by the stage of their suffering, by the crimes they had committed. It was landscape design, using human bodies as the medium. The technical aspects of Vlad's impalement method reveal the depth of his obsession with prolonging suffering. He had perfected a technique that avoided vital organs, allowing victims to remain conscious and in agony for hours or even days. He would personally instruct his executioners on proper stake placement, demonstrating on condemned prisoners like a surgeon teaching medical students. This wasn't just sadism. This was craftsmanship applied to torture. His dining habits extended beyond breakfast. Vlad would host elaborate dinner parties among his impaled victims, forcing guests to maintain normal conversation while surrounded by dying human beings. These weren't just displays of power. They were psychological experiments, tests to see how far he could push the boundaries of human endurance. Guests who showed signs of discomfort or nausea would often find themselves joining the display the following morning. The logistics of maintaining these human exhibitions required an entire administrative apparatus. Vlad employed teams of workers whose sole job was caring for the impaled victims, ensuring they remained alive as long as possible. They would provide small amounts of water to prevent dehydration, tend to wounds to prevent infection, and even provide crude medical care to extend the suffering. It was a bureaucracy of torture, systematic and efficient. Contemporary accounts describe Vlad's personal involvement in every aspect of these displays. He would personally select which stakes to use, determining their height and sharpness based on the crime committed and the social status of the victim. He developed a complex system of impalement styles, with different techniques reserved for different categories of offenders. Thieves were impaled one way, traitors another, foreign diplomats in yet another manner. The psychological profile that emerges from these accounts is that of a man who had completely lost the ability to empathize with human suffering. But it wasn't that he couldn't recognize pain in others. It was that he had learned to derive pleasure from it, to see it as a form of artistic expression. His victims weren't just being punished, they were being transformed into living sculptures in his gallery of agony. What makes Vlad's story particularly chilling is how he maintained this routine for decades without apparent psychological breakdown. This wasn't the behavior of a madman who had lost touch with reality. This was the carefully planned activity of someone who had developed a completely different understanding of what human beings were for. In his worldview, other people existed primarily as raw material for his artistic expressions of power. The international reaction to Vlad's habits was a mixture of horror and fascination. Foreign diplomats would return to their home countries with accounts that seemed too extreme to be believed. Yet the consistency of these reports from multiple independent sources gradually convinced European courts that they were dealing with something unprecedented in the annals of royal cruelty. The most disturbing aspect of Vlad's legacy isn't just the number of people he killed, but the systematic nature of his cruelty. This wasn't random violence or crimes of passion. This was the industrialization of torture, the transformation of human suffering into a daily routine as regular and predictable as any other aspect of royal administration. His end came in the 1476 during a battle against the Ottoman Empire, the same power that had shaped his childhood understanding of cruelty. But even in death, Vlad's influence continued. His methods were studied and copied by other rulers, his techniques preserved in military manuals, his psychological insights into the use of terror as a tool of governance adopted by countless tyrants throughout history. The story of Vlad the Impaler reveals something fundamental about the corrupting nature of absolute power. It shows how authority without limits can transform not just political systems, but human psychology itself. Vlad didn't just rule through fear. He had learned to feed on fear, to derive sustenance from the suffering of others in ways that redefined what it meant to be human. But as disturbing as Vlad's habits were, they pale in comparison to our next ruler, whose obsessions would take us into territory so bizarre that it challenges our very understanding of sanity and power. This is the story of a king whose relationship with reality became so tenuous that his subjects began to question whether they were being ruled by a human being or by something else entirely. Our fourth king brings us to the imperial court of ancient Rome, but to a different emperor, one whose reign would make Nero's theatrical madness seem almost rational by comparison. This is the story of Caligula, born Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus in 12 AD, whose 4-year reign from 37 to 41 AD would become synonymous with madness so complete that it redefined the very concept of imperial insanity. Caligula's transformation from beloved prince to monster began with what appeared to be a severe illness in 37 AD, just months after he had assumed power. When he emerged from his sickbed, something fundamental had changed. The young man who had been celebrated for his wit and charm had become something else entirely, something that would challenge the Roman understanding of what it meant to be human. His first sign of madness manifested in his relationship with the divine. Caligula didn't just believe he was a god, as many emperors had claimed. He insisted on having personal conversations with the statues of gods, treating them as if they were living beings who could respond to his words. Palace servants reported finding him in animated discussions with marble figures, sometimes arguing with them, sometimes laughing at their supposed responses. But these weren't brief moments of eccentricity. These conversations would last for hours, with Caligula gesturing and speaking as if engaged in complex negotiations with divine beings. He would become angry when interrupted during these sessions, insisting that the gods were giving him important information that only he could understand. The emperor had created an entire social life with inanimate objects, preferring their company to that of living humans. The physical manifestations of Caligula's delusions were equally disturbing. He began dressing as various gods, commissioning elaborate costumes that allowed him to impersonate Jupiter, Neptune, and other deities. But these weren't theatrical performances for the entertainment of his court. These were genuine expressions of his belief that he could transform himself into divine beings through costume and ritual. His daily routine became a series of divine impersonations, with different costumes for different times of day. He would wake as Jupiter, conducting the morning's business while wearing golden robes and carrying a thunderbolt. By afternoon, he might have transformed into Neptune, complete with trident and flowing blue garments. Evening might find him as Mercury, wearing winged sandals and carrying a caduceus. The psychological impact on his court was devastating. Senators and nobles were required to participate in these divine charades, addressing Caligula by whatever godly name he had assumed and treating his costume changes as actual transformations. Those who showed any sign of skepticism or amusement were immediately executed, creating an atmosphere of terrified compliance that enabled his delusions to flourish. What made Caligula's behavior particularly disturbing was his treatment of his horse, Incitatus. This wasn't just royal favoritism taken to an extreme. Caligula genuinely believed that his horse was more intelligent and trustworthy than his human advisors. He would consult Incitatus on matters of state, apparently listening for responses that only he could hear. The emperor constructed a palace for his horse, complete with marble stalls, purple blankets, and a collar of precious stones. But more disturbing was how he integrated the animal into his governmental system. Caligula would bring Incitatus to Senate meetings, claiming that the horse had important opinions on legislation. He appointed the animal to the priesthood and reportedly planned to make it a consul, one of the highest offices in the Roman government. The dinner parties, hosted by Caligula, became legendary for their bizarre nature. He would invite senators and their wives to elaborate banquets, then spend the evening having conversations with his horse while ignoring his human guests. He would feed Incitatus from golden bowls while his guests watched in stunned silence, occasionally asking the animal questions about policy matters and nodding as if receiving profound answers. These weren't isolated incidents or temporary lapses in judgment. This was a systematic replacement of human advisors with an animal that Caligula believed possessed superior wisdom. He would spend hours each day grooming and talking to Incitatus, treating these sessions as the most important meetings of his schedule. State business was delayed or ignored, while the emperor consulted his equine counselor. The administrative chaos that resulted from this arrangement was catastrophic. Important decisions were delayed, while Caligula waited for his horse to provide guidance. Military commands were issued based on what the emperor claimed were strategic insights received from Incitatus. The Roman Empire, the most powerful political entity in the world, was being governed according to the supposed wisdom of a horse. Contemporary historians struggled to document these events because they seemed too absurd to be credible. Yet the consistency of multiple independent accounts gradually convinced scholars that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the annals of human governance. A ruler hadn't just gone mad. He had created an entirely new system of government based on communication with animals and inanimate objects. The economic consequences of Caligula's delusions were severe. He spent enormous sums on costumes, divine regalia, and elaborate ceremonies designed to honor his various godly incarnations. The palace for Incitatus consumed resources that could have funded military campaigns or public works. The Roman treasury was being depleted to support the emperor's conversations with statues and horses. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Caligula's reign was how it revealed the fragility of rational governance. The Roman Empire had seemed invincible, its systems of law and administration so sophisticated that they would influence civilization for centuries. Yet one man's madness had reduced this mighty institution to a theater of the absurd, where horses held political office and marble statues served as government advisors. The psychological pressure on those around Caligula was immense. They were required to participate in his delusions while maintaining the facade of normal governance. Senators had to pretend that consulting a horse about legislation was reasonable policymaking. Military commanders had to accept orders that were supposedly inspired by conversations with statues. The entire Roman elite was forced to live in a world where madness had become the official reality. Caligula's end came in 41 AD when members of his own Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers sworn to protect him, assassinated him in an underground passage. But even his death reflected the bizarre nature of his reign. His killers struck not because of political disagreement or military defeat, but because they could no longer tolerate serving a ruler who had lost all connection to human reality. The story of Caligula represents perhaps the most extreme example of how absolute power can sever the connection between a ruler and the world around him. Unlike other tyrants who used their authority to impose their will on others, Caligula had used his power to create an alternate reality where animals were wiser than humans and statues could provide political guidance. This pattern of complete disconnection from reality would manifest in different ways throughout history, but rarely with such devastating consequences for such a powerful empire. Caligula's legacy serves as a warning about what happens when there are no limits on authority, when no one has the power to tell a ruler that his perception of reality is dangerously flawed. Our next ruler will take us from the marble halls of imperial Rome to the windswept steppes of medieval Asia, where power manifested not through divine delusion, but through an appetite for conquest so extreme that it redefined the very concept of warfare and human suffering